Hello friends and welcome to my channel. Well, today is week 1 of For the Most Part from Fort Worth Fabric Studio. It's their newest mystery quilt and I can't wait to get started. This week we have a bunch of cutting to do. This one is a larger size quilt, so week 1 is only going to be cutting. That's it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all the cuts one by one and help you, and hopefully to help you not make a mistake, and I'm going to point out where you need to be careful and kind of things like that. And then next week we'll come back together and we'll sew some blocks. So let's get started. So the first fabric is our Moda Thatched Cream. This is fabric A. And what I want you to know about this fabric is that this is all I had left. That's it, folks. So after you cut all your strips first, that's what I can tell you, because all the fabrics are listed out by strips, and then there's subcuts from those strips. Cut all your strips out first. That way you don't make any mistakes, because this was all that was left after I cut all my strips. So there's no room for error with your strips. So get all those cut first. So I'm going to pitch this because that's really not much. So be careful with this fabric. After you cut your strips, the first set of strips you're going to cut is 11 2.5 inch by width of fabric strips. And from those, you are going to cut 31 2.5 by 12.5 inch rectangles. Now at the end of some of these strips, after you've cut your pieces, you will have little bits left, and I kept those aside just in case somewhere along the way I do make a mistake and I can need some little bits, but there's not much left, so be super careful with these cuts. So the next thing you're going to want to cut is 10 3-inch by width of fabric strips. And from those strips, you are going to have 80, yes, 80, my friends, 83-inch squares. Then you're going to have 16 3-inch by 4-inch rectangles. Then you're going to get 16 3-inch by 2.5-inch rectangles. And then you're going to get 16 3-inch by 1.5-inch rectangles. Okay, and then the next set of directions says 5 2.5-inch by 5.5-inch rectangles. So I'm going to pause right there for just a second and pick these guys up. These are all my 3-inch size pieces, and then our 2.5-inch strips. I'm going to move everything up here. So, like I said, the next piece in the same part with the 3-inch strips said 5 2.5 by 5.5-inch strips, which is right here. I was able to get 6, and the next directions down in the 2.5 by width of fabric strips, which are going to cut 2 of those, it says to cut 11. So I got 6 instead of 5. So the next set of directions, I only had to cut 10. So, but 16 altogether. So whatever way you get them, if you only get 5, you can get 11 out of the next set of strips, or if you can get 6, take 6 out of the next 2.5 by width of fabric strips. At the end of those strips, I did have a few pieces left because I only needed 10 since I got 6 out of the 3-inch strips. So I've got a little scrap there too, just a little kind of tip for a way to get scraps, just in case you make a mistake down the road. Excuse me, I've still got a little bit of a cold, a little bit of a cough, so I apologize, bear with me. Okay, so that's the end of that one. The next thing we're going to cut is 9 3.5-inch by width of fabric strips. Okay, out of the 9 3.5 by width of fabric strips, sorry I have a cough drop in my mouth so I don't cough, so if I sound funny, you're going to need 32 3.5-inch squares, and you're going to need 32 3.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangles. And no problem getting all these cuts. I got them all, and at the end of each strip I had a little bit left over. So you should have plenty of fabric there. The next thing you're going to cut is 5 4.5 by width of fabric strips. And from that, you're going to get 16 4.5-inch squares. Then you're going to get 8 4.5 by 3-inch rectangles. So that's this guy here. Then you're going to get 8 4.5 by 1.75-inch rectangles. And we're getting full on the board here. That's that guy there. And the last thing you need is 8 4.5 by 5.5-inch rectangles. So that's all of our 4.5-inch size pieces. So I'm going to stack these together. I like to keep them together by sizes. So 4.5s, 3.5s. These guys are kind of floating on their own, although they could go with these 12.5-inch strips. And then we've got our 3-inch. So I'm going to put all this away and I'm going to grab the next color. The one thing I did want to point out while I'm grabbing the next color here is that Fort Worth Fabric Studio does have a breakdown in the cutting instructions of which pieces we're using each week. So if you are a labeler, somebody who likes to be super organized, you can separate out all these pieces that we're going through today into weeks. The nice thing about that is then you're not so overwhelmed. You saw that huge pile of background fabric. If you put it into weeks, which I like to use the gallon size Ziploc bags, then it doesn't look like so many pieces. So just one little tip there. Okay, so the next fabric is fabric B, which is Moda's Thatched Chocolate. And from that, you're going to cut a 2.5-inch strip, and you're going to get 8 2.5-inch squares, and you're going to get 4 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangles. This is how much I had left, so there's a little bit extra there. Probably enough for one more 4.5-inch rectangle, and definitely enough for a couple more 2.5-inch squares if you maybe mess up one of those cuts, but not a whole lot extra. So again, be careful. All right, so let's set that one aside. So the next one after that is fabric C, which is the boxwood green. Now there's 2 boxwood greens. There's a lighter one, which is this guy here. Oops. And then there's this darker one, which is this guy here. So I'm going to set the darker one out for a second. So the first one, C, is the lighter green. So this is what I had left from that. So again, just a small strip of fabric, okay? And I really didn't have much scrap left from this when I cut these fabrics, so be careful with this. So the first thing you're going to want to do is cut 4 3-inch by width of fabric strips and 1 4.5 by width of fabric strip. Then from those, you're going to get 8 3-inch by 7.5-inch rectangles, which are these guys here. And then you're going to get 8 3-inch by 10.5-inch rectangles. And this one I had to look at twice just to make sure I was doing it correctly. So double check these measurements. But this was 3-inch by 10.5, but then you go to the 4.5-inch strip and you need 4 4.5 by 10, not 10.5, 10. And the way to get 4 out of your one strip is to do 10-inch. If you do 10.5 by accident, you're going to be short a piece. So watch that very carefully. Okay. So that is the green boxwood, the lighter green. And then we're going to go to the darker green here. So this was a spare piece and this was a spare piece. So again, a really small strip, although this was left over from one of the strips that I cut. So not much left over there. And what you're going to cut first is 3-inch by width of fabric strips, and then again 1 4.5 by width of fabric strip. So very similar to C, but one less strip of 3-inch fabric. So from the 4.5, I'll start with that first. You're going to get 4 4.5 by 7.5-inch rectangles. Okay, so that's number 1. And then from the 3-inch strips, you're going to have 8 3-inch by 5.5-inch rectangles, and then 8 3-inch by 8.5. So a little different measurements than the light green. That'll be a good way to remember which one's which. The next fabric we're going to come to is fabric E, the holly dark green. And this is my cuts. We're making one cut. Excuse me, pardon me. They're all 3.5, not one cut, I shouldn't say that, but they're all 3.5-inch squares. We're cutting 64 of these. 64. Isn't that fabric beautiful? I think this is my favorite fabric. So 64 3.5-inch squares. This is what I had left over. So what I did is I just cut 3.5-inch strips, even though it doesn't say that on the instructions. I'm pretty sure I cut 6, but don't quote me. I'm pretty sure I cut 6 3.5-inch strips, and from those strips cut the 64 3.5-inch squares. Okay, but this is all I had left after I cut the strips. So again, not much left over. And that's my favorite fabric. That's beautiful. Fabric F is the Winter Floral Natural. Now this is the one that I had the most left over. This is the piece that I had left over. So quite a bit. Excuse me, I apologize. I have 8 6.5 inch squares here. So 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. And that's all there is to that. So 8 6.5 inch squares. Really simple. And a big piece left over, which is nice. All right, the next thing I'm going to grab is the thatched chrism. I meant thatched crimson, not chrism. Sorry, guys. Apparently, I can't talk and I can't read. So, this is what I had left over from the crimson after I cut it. So, a good bit, actually. And you need 12 2.5 inch squares. So, a nice bit left over in case you misplace one. You have plenty here. So, good bit on that. The next one after that is fabric H, which is the Holly Berry Green. And this one, a little bit easier, not much to do except cut these into strips. So I've got them folded up here. And there's 8 2.5 by width of fabric strips. And this is what you have left over. So not enough to make another strip. So again, super careful with your cutting. I straightened the one edge and then just cut all my strips all the way down. And that's what I had left over. Okay. So that one was really simple. After that is the Fabric I poinsettias. I love poinsettias. And again, this was straightforward strips. So we needed 8 3-inch by width of fabric strips. And I've got these all folded, but they're in strips. So just to keep them kind of neat. Because I know I'll be ironing them again anyway once we go to use them. And then this is the piece that I had left over. So again, not enough to make a whole nother strip. So be super careful when you cut these. Trim just a smidgen off the edge just to straighten up your line and then cut all your strips. Okay? And the last thing that's left is fabric J, the ribbon red. Now, excuse me, I'm so sorry. For binding strips, this lists 8 2.5 by width of fabric strips. So if you notice, your stripes are running selvage to selvage, right? So if you cut this selvage to selvage, you're going to have stripes that are running this way. So when you put that on your quilt, you might just get a red or white line all the way around. So if you want more of a candy cane stripe, what Fort Worth Fabric Studio is recommending is that you cut this fabric, instead of cutting it selvage to selvage, you cut it from the raw edges the opposite direction. But if you do it that way, you're going to have to cut a whole bunch of strips. I think it's like 20 or 26. And you're going to have to piece them all together. Now, do you want to do all that work? That's up to you. If you don't mind your stripes running this direction, and you may only see, once you like bind the quilt, you may only see something like this, because you're just going to see just the very edge, you're okay with that, then you can cut these selvage to selvage, and you can cut the 8 2.5 by width of fabric strips. And that's why I didn't cut these yet, because I wanted to show this to you guys before I decided what to do, because I'm actually not sure what I want to do, because I don't know if I really want to piece together 20 or I think it's 26 little strips this way, which would be cute because it would make that stripe like this when you're binding, right? The stripes would be going this way. It would be a lot easier to cut it selvage to selvage, but it's not going to be as cute. So I've got a debate in my mind what I'm going to do, because I don't necessarily want to piece together that many strips, but I do think it will look better. So it's up to you. You can either cut it selvage to selvage like they have it and cut 8 of those 2.5 inches by width of fabric, or you can cut it this way, the other direction, and piece together a whole bunch of pieces. So that's why I hadn't cut it yet. I've got time. We've got 5 weeks of, well, 4 weeks after this week of sewing to do, and then of course it'll have to be quilted, and then before I have to bind it. So I've got some time to think about that. I will show you my backing fabric, which you can get backing fabric from Fort Worth Fabric Studio. This is my backing fabric. So a stripe will definitely look really, really nice against that, especially if it is that way. So I may take the time to go ahead and piece all those, but that's not something that I want to do today. So I can show you this way too. So if I made the decision to go salvage to salvage, it's going to look something like that. So it definitely does look, I think it does look better the other way, like that. But it's just a matter if you want to do the extra work. So there you go. All right, so that's all your fabric cuts. So get all these cut over the next week. Organize them by week if that's how you like. And then we will sew next Monday right here on my channel, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Well, thank you, friends, for joining me today. And I can't wait till next week till we can sew some blocks. Don't you love this fabric? It's so gorgeous. Thank you so much again to Jody at Forward Fabric Studio. Love your sew-alongs, and I'm so looking forward to this one. I'm really excited that we're doing a little bit bigger of a quilt and that we will have it done in time for the upcoming winter season. All right, guys, well, take care and stay safe. And until I see you next, happy sewing. Bye.